need them to pay attention. Let's go ahead and get started this morning. Am I on? Brother Allen, will you open us in a word of prayer? But before you do, Brother Roy, can you give us an update on your son? To relieve the pressure on the brain? Does that make him one better? 2 weeks ago, we started, actually, I should say this way, all the where I'll stay. 2 weeks. Some people don't want to be a thinking person because they're not here. You know which ones? So make sure that they hear that. But as we go through this, the whole idea is today Christians are painted as gullible and not thinking, and we just live life on this blind leap of faith. And although some of that might be true, it's not supposed to be. We're supposed to be the people that come together in reason. And it's crucial for Christianity because, and I've said this, I'm going to try to say this every week, but the heart has a real problem getting behind anything that the mind hasn't decided. And so if in our mind we're going back and forth, well, Justin, that's why it's the battle for the mind. You hear that phrase all the time. Romans 12, 1 and 2, it talks about renewing our mind. When that is said, it's easy for the heart to get behind it. In fact, we'll live and die for things that we believe. But if we honestly don't believe them, we're into the water, the out of the water. We're into the water and out of the water. And that may explain why sometimes life of a Christian seems to be like this. And so I think it's very important we spend some time making sure that we realize that there are some reasons for us to believe what we believe. This is not just pulled out fable, especially since that's the way our society tries to paint it. Historically, we do know some things, and very few people would argue this. Historically, we know that in the late 30s and 40s, that's not 1930s and 1940s, that's 30 AD, that's 40 AD, that's a long time ago. We know that in the late 30s and 40s, there were some Jewish men, we call them disciples, who went out into the Roman Empire proclaiming a very strange message. And they started in the late 30s, and we know this. By AD 64, when Rome was burning, they were a large enough group and a big enough problem that Nero was able to blame the burning of Rome on them and thought he was going to take care of two things at one time. Because, Brother Allen, they were just growing and growing. And if you go to the book of Acts, today, and we should celebrate this, by the way. We celebrate adding one person to the church roll. Well, if you go through the book of Acts, it talks, and they were added daily, and then it was multiplied, and it was multiplied, and it was multiplied. It easily became a very big number. We're talking about in 30 years, it was a problem for the empire. The greatest empire this world has ever known was thinking about Christians. And so we know these things. And what makes it even more shocking is when you jump in there a little bit, the message these guys were talking about, these were Jewish men who got up every morning and recited the Shema, the Lord our God is one God, and they have this picture that God is here and man is here, and there's this huge gulf in between, and never do they cross over. And these guys were saying, Yahweh became man and he lived down here, and by the way, he's the Messiah, and he died, and Rome's still here, and it was a very strange message. Now, these were religious men. They were devoutly religious men. Their entire value system, their belief system was based upon this Shema that they quoted every single day. What would make them change from believing what they've always been raised to running around and teaching this Christianity? Brother Hamilton, luckily, I don't have to guess at that because they wrote that down. And that is what we call the New Testament. Now, we've been going through Luke. We've used Luke as kind of a jumping off point. And Luke, Eric, give me Luke 1 through 4. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, other people have written it down already, speaking about the other Gospels, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses. There were eyewitnesses at this time and ministers of the word. Go on. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou, purpose for the book of Luke, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. And so we know what affected these men because they wrote it down to tell us these things happened, and that's why we are who we are. Now, give me the next slide. Here's where the question, here's where that brings us. Brother Hank, I'm telling you, historically, we know these men lived. We know they did these things. We know they wrote these things. We have these books. We have this historical picture right there. The question for you to answer is, do you believe what they wrote down? Do you believe when they say this is the reason that these things really happened? If you do, then get on board, settle it in your mind, let your heart get behind it, and that'll affect your life every day going forward. If you don't, if you're going to say, no, I don't believe that, and that happens. Ben, if you're talking to someone about your Christianity, and you get to, in the book of John, Romans, it's very easy for them to get to this point. Well, I don't really believe that. Okay, well here, why not? Because there's only two ways to go. There's only two things. You don't believe because we know that they're historical documents. So you don't believe what they say. Well, there's only two reasons you can come up with. I don't believe what they say because I believe they intentionally misled everyone. They were liars. They created a conspiracy to develop this religion, and the whole world bought it. And here's where we are today. Or you're going to say, well, they were good men. By the way, it's pretty common. It's common on TV. It's common for your neighbor to say, well, they just made it up. That is not a common theory among the intellectuals because that's crazy. Okay, we looked at some things last week. We'll go over them really quickly this morning. But the biggest thing is these men died for something they made up? No. So that's where most intellectuals are going to disagree, but they'll use this, what we're calling the legendary theory. They're going to say, okay, they truly believed it, Brother Brucci. Unfortunately for them, they were just wrong. Okay, a legend grew, and they believed the legend, and we're still following after that same legend, and that's where we live. Now, the conspiracy theory is where we spent our time last week. Eric, you got that review? I think. These are the things we brought up last week when we talked about the conspiracy theory. First, There is no evidence that this was a conspiracy theory. Do you not understand this was a major problem in the world at that time? What they wanted to do was do away with Christianity. If they could have found any evidence, because they were looking, then it would be gone. Find any evidence that it was a conspiracy, any evidence that they got it all together, any evidence that they were trying to fool all the world because they really thought they could get that far, and it would have ended in the first century. But they couldn't, which is why it's still here. Not only was there no evidence, but there's no motive. Come up and give me a benefit that they had. Okay, we know how they were treated. Historical documents. We know that the word Roman candle is not about a firework. I mean, it's a true old, ancient word because they would take Christians, impale them, dip them in tar, and burn them. And then they got tired of the smell of burning tar, and so they realized we can wrap the rope around them that we dipped in oil, and it will use their own human fat to burn a nice long time. And so we'll impale the dad, we'll take the mom to the party, and we'll throw the kid to the lions. Yay! And private jets and limos like some people today do. There's no motive. So, not only was there no motive, but there were no deserters. Nobody cracked. Now, last week we used this picture of and we don't even blink at it these days. I mean, like, we know, okay, boom, go on. Did it really hurt anything? Not facing torture, not facing a Roman candle, not first facing watching your wife or daughter be thrown into the lion's den, yet no one cracked. At their time, Watergate, it wasn't 12 hours, we know now, before people were trying to make deals behind the scenes. And within 2 weeks, within 12 days, it was all out. People couldn't wait to line up and say, protect my own skin. But we don't have one in all the torture of the first century. Oh, the person you're talking to, well, I think there probably was, we just don't know. That's a big leap of faith. Because I'm going to tell you, faith goes beyond the evidence. What evidence do you have for that thing you just made up out of the sky? Because we have a pretty good amount of evidence. Okay, then not only was there no motive, but if we were, Brother Wayne, if you and I and Brother Brucci and Brother Brucci Jr. go out to lunch and we're going to say, we want to be, we don't have a motive, so I can't give you why we're going to do this, but we're going to do this. And we say, let's make up a religion that we can get people to follow because no reason, but we're going to do it anyway. We would not make up the gospel. We would not make up a man who dies on a tree, who rises again, and we'll get into some of that. Sadducees were in control at this point. Rising again was not a good thing. We would not make names. This wasn't like, and somebody said, and we stood before Pilate. We went to Caiaphas' house. I was buried in the tomb of somebody who sat on the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus came to me by night. These were important people. All one of them had to do was say, false, not true, it's over. But they didn't. So, we're going to talk about the conspiracy theory. Didn't make a whole lot of sense. Now that only leaves one option. That means we're going to say we believe it was legend. Okay, and like telephone, you know, that's how legend goes. Like telephone, oh, Jesus shared his bread. And 500 years later, Jesus is making bread. Oh, Jesus prayed for the sick. Oh, Jesus healed the sick. We're going to try to say that this is legend. And most of the scholars who attack the New Testament attack it through this some sort of legend theory. And we've got 6 points, 6.5, 6A, if we can get through that fast. And first is pretty simple. It falls back on some of the things we said last week. But you got to understand first century Palestine. First century Palestine is not an area that's conducive for making up a legend. A couple weeks ago, we spent some time on this, but the Sadducees, there are basically two ruling parties in Palestine, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees were actually in control at this time. They were the liberals. They were the smart, the intellectuals. They were Harvard and Yale. They were the ones who said that, that we don't believe in the supernatural, that there isn't going to be a resurrection from the dead, but that this is how you have to live life, and there is a God, and I don't exactly understand all around, but those things aren't going to happen, and there's no miracles. And they were in charge, and you wanted to be with the group that was in charge, the intellectuals. You certainly were not going to allow a legend of a man who died and rose and was Messiah and was God and performed miracles.
We crucified him.
Well, they had help with that one too. Sad thing is that was me. And then the Pharisees, the Orthodox group. Okay, they're just going to wake up every morning and defend, Lord our God is one God, and he's in heaven, and no one else is God, and there's a straight gulf in between. And it is not conducive for this thing to grow like telephone, on and on and on. Somewhere the teacher is bringing down the ruler, slapping the ear off, and it's going to stop. It is not the environment that we would think this gives birth to. And on top of that, then you had the scribes whose whole job was to protect and to guarantee the Old Testament, and nothing was going to be added to it. Just waiting for the Messiah to come and kick some Roman tail and get us out of here. Let us rule the earth. This did not fit the narrative. And that brings up point two. If you're going to give birth to a legend, it's not going to be this one. Legends almost always intensify something in the culture's need. I'll use this as an illustration. One of Josh's favorite movies is, I just forgot, it's written from the book The Scottish Chiefs, William Wallace, Braveheart. Scottish Chiefs about like this big. I was made to read it by a teacher who was up the way I said. 1900 and something pages. And Old English. It's really hard. So I have a fondness for William Wallace long before the movie came out. But in the movie, there's this part where William Wallace, the Scottish revolutionary who's fighting against England, he's riding back and forth in front of the army and he's like, I am William Wallace. And they all laugh at him, ha ha, and William Wallace. And then he has to deal with the legend. I know William Wallace is 7 feet tall. He kills England. He kills the English by the hundreds. If he were here, he'd destroy that army with fireballs out of his eyes. But I am William Wallace. You see, and that's what happens with legends. They grow just to be like that. Look, the English are bad. The Scottish are right. We need a pure, perfect, strong man who would lead us, and we'll win. And none of this fits the Christ that's portrayed to us in the New Testament. Okay? He dies on a cursed tree. You know, Deuteronomy says, curses anyone who dies on the tree. Long before the New Testament would tell us that he was forsaken of his father. Tough to be a leader there, too, by the way. God forsook him. Follow him, God forsook him. Who writes this stuff if you're creating a legend? No, a legend is 7 foot tall and shoots fireballs out of his eyes. And he kills people by the hundreds. He doesn't say to a Jewish congregation, I and my Father are one. If you've seen the Father, you've seen me. See me, you've seen the Father. Here we are. Not unless he wants to be stoned. You want to be laughed at. You want that legend to end. If this is legend, it ends. He was worshipped. Preacher, do you ever wonder when you get to heaven if there's like Peter's going to be sitting there waiting to talk to you? If he's going, you know what you said about me? When I was setting up, I said, dull disciples. I actually put blockheads. I thought dull was better. Because I just kept thinking, I wonder if they're going to say, hey, we got a word with you.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, in legends, they're heroes. Okay? They don't do this. They don't do this. Mark chapter 10. I'm going to go to Jerusalem to be crucified. Son of Man's going to go and die. Okay, can we sit on your right hand? I want to sit on your right. Can my brother sit on your left? Mark 10, 33, 35. It's like 3 verses after he says, I'm going to die. Okay, can we sit on your right hand? They don't. They don't. Love your neighbor. Do good to them that curse you. Oh, they chase you out of the city? Call down fire and destroy it, Lord. The disciples just don't get it in the story. This is not legend writing. This reads like total reality. This doesn't fit. This would not make Marvel storybook. And the legend heroes are always super guys. Now, you can start, Google's great or dangerous. You can start looking for things. Preacher, you can find 300 years later in a commentary. I found this on Monday, and then I went back to find it again, and it was taking too much time. That's what you get when you delete your history. But the PC was running slow, so just clean up everything. But 300 years later, there was a commentary on Acts where Peter was confronting Simon, Acts 8. And he's confronting Simon the magician. And in this commentary it says, and Peter flew around Jerusalem, and that's how he won the confrontation with Simon. See, legends get created. But that's not what the Gospels read like. It just doesn't fit. And you can go a little bit further when you start going in here. It doesn't fit legend making. Right, in this time, but in this time a woman couldn't even testify in court unless she had a man to corroborate her testimony. They were pretty much just assumed that they were weak and gonna lie. Look at how much women are part of the gospel story. Oh, you can do this. Who goes to the grave first? While the men were doing what? Seriously, think about who would write this? Jewish men hiding while the women went and confronted, found out. No, this isn't legend making. If not for the Holy Ghost, that's not written down. In fact, Paul in his accounts leave that out. He's a friend of sinners, publicans. This is not how you write a legend. I'll give you this too. The most important point, probably. There's not enough time for a legend. Christ dies. 3 months later, we have Peter preaching. That's a pretty quick telephone. That's the second person. You know, when you start talking about this, preacher, I've actually done this. I've done this, a little kid, trying to quote things I heard at Arizona State. And I had the professor come back to me. It was some literature class. I was there for math. I don't even know what I was doing in literature class. My brother was the English guy, and so I hated it because you don't compete in those things. You can't win. The older brother was always better. Had stuff published when he was in like 8th grade, so I was math and logic. But I remember I was in there in some literature class, and he was like tearing up the New Testament. And I was 6th grade, 7th grade, something like that. Summertime, we were moving. And I did the whole, well, you're going to tell me that a Jewish carpenter and the people followed him, and Justin had a pretty good response. Well, at least to a 6th grader. He said, well, let me tell you. Buddha was an atheist. I tried to go and look up and find out. Buddha was an atheist. Buddha was an atheist. And yet, Buddha is worshipped as a god. So if I tell you that an atheist could grow in legend to be worshipped as a god, you're going to tell me it's so hard to find out somebody who worships God and is a godly culture, ends up following after your Jewish carpenter? It would seem actually that this would be much easier to follow after a devout Jew rather than an atheist. And preacher, I was like, I dreaded going to that class like the next month. But then later, I realized it took 500 years for that to happen. It wasn't even 5 months, let alone 50 years, 5 years. It took 500 years after Buddha's death before he was what do you call it, deitized, is that a word? What am I looking at you for? Deitized, One English word. Yeah, 500. And then he's made a God, not the God. In a culture, not the Jewish culture, where God will get you stoned. You don't write Yahweh. But a culture where they deitize, that's a word, everything. Yeah, it's a really bad comparison, but it was the best comparison that the professor had. And I started reading some books, and this is what made me remember. I started looking at some things the last couple of weeks. But you know how often that is the comparison that's brought up? Everybody just goes to the pat same answer. Well, that's a stupid answer. It took 500 years. I don't have 5 months. 3,000 people followed Peter. And it didn't take that long. And those people were probably devout Jews showing up for a reason. And they heard him teach something that goes against everything that was their value system. And there was enough proof in that time and enough eyewitnesses around that it made sense. And they changed their life and ended up changing their homes and running out and fleeing to keep their life to the rest of the world. Just wasn't enough time. When you start talking about this, and I'm trying to go through some of this stuff quicker. I mean, each one of these are points to use next week. So. But when you start talking about this, everything has a rebuttal. Man, you can't be walking out of here. Oh, Jeremy, now I'm ready to talk to everybody. Because they have a rebuttal. When you start to talk, people start like, I'm going to give you a verse from Mark. Eric, give me Mark 50. Yeah. Okay. So that, isn't that like one of the most exciting verses you ever heard? And they compelled one Simon a Cyrenian who passed by, coming out of the country, to follow Alexander and Rufus to bear his cross. Woohoo! Yeah, that doesn't seem like a whole lot, right? Historically, that's a whole lot. Let's look at it again. You know what that does? That dates the writing of the book of Mark. Preacher, he's writing to a group of people that he expects to know. Who Alexander and Rufus are. So we don't know who they are, but they did. And so he's saying it was their dad. You know, these two guys you know, it was their dad. That's who carried the cross. Which tells us that this is written within one generation, within 30 years of that crucifixion, which is important because when people start to contest the fact that there's no time, they start to say, well, we don't really know when the book of Mark was written. And they start to challenge the authority of some of the writings. Because if you're going to use Mark to corroborate some of the things that were written in Matthew, I'll tell you another thing specifically about Mark. All right, Mark is written as if he's an eyewitness. There's very little chance Mark was an eyewitness. So, how can these things be? Well, first, let's not forget we believe in this part of the deity, this deity, not part of the deity called the Holy Spirit. Let's not forget that. But also, you know, old church history will say Mark probably was the one who transcribed, who actually wrote for Peter. And there's a really good shot that the book of Mark is the book of Peter, right? It's Peter's eyewitness. Now, I don't know that, which is why I'm not going to spend a whole lot, but I'm just telling you, if you're going to start pulling theories out to attack things that are known, there's really good answers for them that make you look them down. There's not enough time for legend to grow. And I'm going to tell you, we've got a ton of cooperation that it was written during this time. Paul wrote most of his books between 20 and 40 years AD. Mark, probably about 30 AD. Matthew, about 30 AD. Luke, not 30 AD. Luke, about 30 years after. I'm going to tell you, Luke and Acts were written before 64 AD. If you read the book of Acts, it just stops. But there's a bunch of things that happened in early 60 Jerusalem that are not included in there. There's a whole war that's not included in there. It just stops, probably because that book stopped before. Probably written around 60 AD, about 30 years after the crucifixion. John, about 30 years. Peter, about 30 years. James, 20 years. Jude, about 30 years after. Josephus about 50 years after. Roman historian named Clement of Rome about 60 years after. None of these are 500 years like Buddha. Well, 30 years after, 50 years after, 60 years after, that seems like a long time. We have one historian who tells us literally almost everything we know about Alexander the Great comes from one historian named Arenas. There's another one of those names, I hope I'm right. And it was written 400 years after Alexander the Great. Yet nobody says Alexander the Great never existed. We're challenged. We know from one person. I'll give you another thought. How could a legend develop when these people were still alive? Richard, those are the times that these books were written. How could a legend develop? Maybe. I was thinking about this. Trying to figure out how you... brothers. I know about brothers. I've watched three of them grow up. So, then we played a football game where, but the easiest pass to throw in the ball was a deep post. Because, can't be covered if there's no safety in there. And this guy's on this side, you throw it short, the receiver can get to it. If he's undercutting, you throw it deep, the receiver can get to it. We had a great receiver. Anytime we were in trouble, we had a strong arm quarterback, he just threw it out. The receiver made him look good. We scored touchdowns. We went and played a team up in Jacksonville with two guys going to Florida on track scholarships. And one of them played deep safety. And Hank, we kept trying to throw that pass. I think they picked it off a couple of times. It was just terrible. We ended up being down 3 scores. So I ran the ball. And I ran the ball, and I ran the ball, and I ran the ball, and I ran the ball. And Josh ended up with 380-something yards. And I don't know, like 6 touchdowns. Sounds like a big deal, right? So I didn't pay attention to that. All I'm trying to do is win a game. And I couldn't get the quarterback to throw anything other than the deep post. No matter how many times I called the timeout and said, don't throw that at me. And they just kept there waiting. So we ran it, ran it, ran it. And then it was in practice the next day. And all these guys were talking about, oh, Josh ran for 400 yards, and Josh had 8 touchdowns, and Josh, and Josh, and Josh. Well, Eric was at practice. This is like Monday's practice. Game's Friday. I haven't even looked at film. Don't even want to look at film. Don't ever want to play that team again. And Josh is there, and all these guys are talking over here. Eric's at practice. I'm pretty sure Eric goes, he didn't rush for 400 yards. He rushed for 382 yards, and he had 38 carries. And I usually only got 8 carries, and I have more yards in the season. And let me tell you, that's what brothers do. And his brothers were alive. So if you start talking about feeding 5,000, it wasn't 5,000, it was 5. You know who would have said that? How do you create a legend in such a short period when the people who are involved in the story are still alive? We will not let that happen. I'll give you more Jade, more Eric fun. Just about every day I get to watch Eric and Jade, and I do. It's better than TV. It's a living sitcom. If they talk for an hour, in that hour, one of them will correct the other. They're going to be telling the story. Well, it wasn't that hot. It wasn't that much. It didn't taste that good. Somebody corrects the other. They do not go an hour without correction. You're not going to exaggerate on my time. Now I just start watching, see the looks. It used to be Jade. Jade used to be the driver of that. Well, now Jade just kind of gave it in. Eric, for sure, kicked it in the 4th year. Boom! Always. And she just rolls right. I'm going to tell you, same thing will be happening in this time. These people were alive. You can't build a legend while they're alive because they won't let it happen. You think you can exaggerate without somebody saying, whoa, 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 it wasn't that? James would have been his worst critic. Remember, James didn't believe. Not only was he not the critic, but he became a leader in the church. At some point, the legend theory bleeds over into conspiracy theory. If you think this isn't going to happen, the only reason it doesn't happen is because they all get together and they agree they're not going to correct things. In such a short period, this did not grow into a legend. We'll go through these scholar, C.S. Lewis, when he studied fables and he wrote on them. And this is what he said. This is one of the reasons that prompted him to continue to study. And he would say, I've spent my life studying legends, and if there is one thing the Gospels aren't, it's legend. The Gospels claim to write history, and they read like history. Luke claims to write history. Did I ask you 1 John? Give me 1 John. Oh, you did. That which was from the beginning, that which we have heard, that which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word of life. For the life was manifested. He lived among us, and we saw it, and we bear witness, and we show unto you that eternal life which was with the Father, and was manifested unto us. That which we have seen and heard declare we unto you, that ye also may have fellowship with us. And truly, our fellowship was with the Father and his Son, Jesus. They claim to be writing down history. These things happened. That which I saw, that which I heard, that which I witnessed, that which I touched, that which was real and part of life. That is what I'm writing down. They were not writing stories. This is not creative writing class. They do not claim to ever be writing creative writing. They claim that they are writing down history. And I will tell you, there is a key tenet to how we evaluate history in the Western world. And it's pretty simple. When you're dealing with an ancient document, if that document claims to record history, if it reads like history, then it must be accepted as history, and it is up to you to disprove it. Now that is true in everything that we do, except when it comes to the New Testament. Then they create a different set of rules. I'm going to tell you, when we start talking about things like I said before, where we, 400 years after, we have one person who tells us about Alexander the Great, if you had to corroborate that, how are you going to do it? There is nobody else. We have writer after writer it is written as history. It should be accepted as history because it cannot be disproven. For years they tried to disprove it with things like, we have several Roman registrars and they don't say the town Nazareth, so Jesus of Nazareth must be a lie. And let me just first, right? First, we now have found things that say Nazareth, and we know about 30 people live there. But, which is why can any good thing come out of Nazareth? But let me just give you this thought. Please let me give you this thought. If you were writing something down at that time period, and you knew that people were going to read it, and you're going to say you came from Nazareth and there is no Nazareth, how stupid are you? Let me introduce you to my Messiah, Hank Mornellero. He comes from Ooga Booga Land. Well, you might ask, where is Ooga Booga Land? It's right out there at the other side of Plant City. No, that's what there was no Nazareth. Well, we now know after about 50 years of attacks on the New Testament, because there's no Nazareth on the Roman register. Well, here's one that has Nazareth on it. Or a huge attack on the book of Luke. Census was wrong. They did not take censuses that way. About 50 years. Throw the whole thing away. Rome did not require that. There was no census like that. That didn't happen. We now know that there's about a 60-year period where censuses were done exactly that way. Not only is it not disproven, but given time, it keeps, which is the opposite of what should happen. Given time, it should be harder and harder. This is history. But given time, it's become more and more proven. And last, it reads a testimony by the witnesses. It reads just like it is, like it's written. You know, you go to the book of Mark, and over again it says, and Jesus looked around, and then he spoke. I tried to do that. That's hard to do. But why do you write that down? That's eyewitness. That's somebody who was saying, and this is what he would do. He stood up before them. He looked around. He examined the group. That comes from eyewitness testimony. There's all these little crazy details in there. I asked him to give me, there's probably not a more liberal group of people in the entire world than Tübingen Seminary, in Tübingen, Germany. They once asked Wolfgang its reliability. This is taken from his paper. He actually spoke there. And after blowing their doors off, he ended up becoming a professor there. But this is what he said. We cannot be other than captivated by the experiential vividness. That's talking about eyewitness testimony. Experiential vividness, that's a head being taught for eyewitness testimony. Experiential vividness with which we are confronted in the Gospels. I know of no other area of history which I've spent my whole life studying of historical writing, biography, or poetry where I can encounter so great a wealth of material in such a small space. They probably weren't very happy with that result. But I asked Eric to give me John 20? Oh, you get it wrong. It's probably my fault. John 20. And we'll just read this and be done. John 20, probably the first 6. I want you to just look at how much stuff is in here. Oh, you got it there? The first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, all right? It's the first day, and it's early, and now they're about to tell us it's still dark out. Those are crazy little bits of information which you don't get in legend writing. When it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre, and seeth the stone taken away from the sepulchre. Boom. Then she runneth and cometh to Simon Peter and to the other disciples who Jesus loved. Now this is in John, right? It's in John. Notice, it didn't come to Peter or John. It came to the other disciple. You know, my humility, the other disciple. I'm not going to put my name in my own book. But I'm the one he loved. I know he's going to be standing right there someday and say, hey, that was a little rude. But really, you know, he's the one who always wanted to sit on the right or the left. I always want to be sitting real close. It just reads of the guy who's writing it. And saith unto them, we have taken away, she runneth unto Simon and the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and saith unto them, they have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him. Let me tell you that we is a really important thing too. When they attack the Gospels, that's one of the things. If you go to Matthew and Mark, it talks about other women being there. You know, Mary's not there, and look, John says Mary was the one who went, and what about the other? No, Mary says they were there. We were there. It's just, she's the one who ran. She must have been the fastest. And so, she's the one named, but there were others there. Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. So they ran both together, but I was faster. Come on, Matt, you could be writing this. yeah, this is my best friend. We were really good friends. We do everything together. He was always behind me. Did outrun Peter and came first to the sepulchre, but I'm humble. I didn't put my name in there. I didn't say I'm faster. I didn't say he's slower. And he's stooping down. Tells you something right there, very important. You know, rich graves were built where you had to get down underneath because they were hard to steal from. He was in Joseph from Arimathea's grave. And saw the linen clothes lying, yet he went not in. Just a little peekaboo. Ooh, spooky. I gotta wait. I gotta wait for Peter. I gotta wait for something bigger and stronger. Yeah, man. Give your friend credit. Then comes Simon Peter following him, and he went into the sepulchre and seeth the linen clothes lie. Did you stop at 6? Oh, keep going. And the napkin that was just about his head was not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together. And just look at the detail that's given. This is ready for court. It's like they're telling you how to fold it into the swan. They give you every piece of information. And he saw and then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre. Then went in the other disciple. You don't know the one who got there first. All of the Gospels read exactly like this. They're full of eyewitness testimony. And an expert who was called on to disprove it and throw it out the window had to say, I know of no other historical writing, none, nothing compares, that has the experiential record, that has the eyewitness testimony that this has, which leads us to this. Conspiracy theory is just absolutely positively crazy. But if you're going to believe, if you're going to come to the place over, well, I believe that they just believe the legend. Then you're going to have to deal with the fact that there's not time for
terrible culture for climate to grow in, that it's full of eyewitness testimony, that again and again as time has gone by, it's not disproven, it shows itself to be true. But in the end, Matt, faith goes beyond the evidence. All we're saying is, what are you going to wager your life on? Because conspiracy theory or legend theory, they are a leap of faith. They are gullible. I am much more willing to invest and believe that this is exactly what it says it is. That these men were exactly there, and they changed their life because they walked and talked with us. And they saw him rise again. And they wrote it down, just like John says, that we might have fellowship. And I look forward to that day. Do I believe? Listen, I'm a white guy. I'm done. I'm sorry. It's like that. Why not believe? That's the question. Yeah, because they tell us to believe in aliens and to believe in big bangs, and it's a much bigger leap of